All right. Boom shakalaka, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters around the world. You are listening to the most conscious comedy podcast in the multiverse, the Krishool Journey. It's your resident host, Krishool, and I have a very special guest here, Scott Swain. Scott Swain is many things. This guy's written a book. We're going to get into that. Deals with empathy, society, relationships, and how to navigate these intricate relationships that we're caught up in society. But ladies and gentlemen, before I get into it, I just want to get some business out of the way. So I have an album that is coming out. The date is set. It is March the 28th. I'm very excited about this. It's called Apotheosis. It's a culmination of all my works of art over the last, 7 years or so. So I'm very excited about that. Be out on all digital platforms. And of course, I got the podcast still rocking. I got some interesting guests lined up, like we got Scott over here. Ladies and gentlemen, now be sure to give us a review. Tell your mom, tell your friends about me. You can find me on the iTunes, on the Spotify's. Appreciate those that have been dropping the comments, telling their moms, telling their friends about me, giving us a review. That all helps. And you can find me on the TikToks. That's where I post most of my videos. Trying to keep myself all over the interwebs these days. You got to make use of all the social media. But I want to get into first topic of discussion here, which is all about empathy. And I'm going to let Scott Swain start off by introducing himself, talking about his new book, his entire journey, and let's let this conversation go where it will. So, Scott, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself? Let us know who you are, your mission, this book of yours. Let's get it.
Well, let's see. I'm a nerd, as in really into, since I was a kid, computers and reading, and my mom used to need to tell me to go outside and play, and I would find ways not to. I was always a very into stillness person. And she was a hippie. She had me when she was 16, and she was a black sheep of the family. She took me and ran off from my dad when I was 3, and we hitchhiked around the country, the US, and lived with whoever would take us in. And it was quite an adventure. I mean, sometimes there was worry and things like that and problems, but I think it shaped some positive things, as in adaptation and a desire for adventure and things like that. I got good at imagination because I'd be alone a lot. I'd sit alone and just dream up worlds and read a lot since I was, in my mom's vagina. She would put books up in there. So I've been reading forever. Zoom to now, we can back up anytime, but really what it's all about is the now, isn't it?
Absolutely. So what are you currently engaged in? What's your passion, your focus?
Well, here's a kind of a epiphany I had recently so the book, it's called A Practical Empath, Rewire Your Mind. And I guess I was 99% sure or 90% sure or something that I was telling the truth, that you can really rewire your mind, become more empathetic, blah, blah, blah. And by following various techniques that I've learned and developed and coagulated into one thing or a group of things. And then over the process of the last X number of years, learning what I needed to learn to write this thing, but then especially after publishing it, and leading up the weeks and months leading up to, like, just crunching and writing hard and working, every day, and just getting really consistent and disciplined with it. And then especially after publishing it and rereading it almost every day, or big chunks. I mean, it's like, well, it's not huge. It's like 250 pages or something, but definitely rereading huge chunks of it every day. What it did is it did rewire my mind. I found that, of course, over the past 19 plus years of studying this stuff and writing articles about it and whatever, and talking about it and doing groups, I was leveling up my empathy powers, put it that way, right? But then back to like the now of the past few months after I published it in December, I noticed a massive ramping up of my empathy, just a natural increase in, and everything, including, I talk about this in the book, is gratitude. Like having, and I've always had this sort of childlike look at or way of perceiving the universe and that which is around me, and just a wonder. Yay, somehow I held on to that, even though I'm 78 years old.
Oh wow.
Which you can't.
You're joking, right? Yeah.
I am joking.
Oh
But
yeah, I'm like, I was gonna be like, I mean, I thought I looked good for my age. I'm like, damn, those empathy powers certainly realign your telomeres, man. Damn, I gotta get onto that.
No, but a gratitude that has amplified it, definitely. I mean, of course, the things like I walk outside every day and seeing a blue sky, or even finding appreciation in a not blue sky.
Sure. It's probably a good idea if we could just back up just to talk about exactly what empathy is. So I know you recently released the book. I didn't realize it was just fresh off the boat just a few months ago, but I'm curious as to why you wrote the book. Maybe that has to do with your own upbringing. I don't know if you were the black sheep of the family. I mean, I think we all deal with relationship problems, whether it's with friendships, family, and so forth. And I think having empathy can enhance that. But whereas your book started off by discussing what empathy is, I think it's a good place because I realized not only do I have a different idea of it, but I think a lot of people might have a different interpretation of what empathy means, at least to how you describe it. So what is your idea of empathy and why is it important? If you can start there, and perhaps why you chose to write the book.
Yeah, I like that you asked it that way. What is my idea about what empathy is? Because I found, I do these groups every week where we practice empathy, and I don't like to say everybody, but I think everybody has their own view of what empathy is and sympathy, and there's a lot of confusion and differing ideas. And so for my book, I make it real clear that the empathy that I am using here and that I support is okay. I'm going to back up a little.
Sure.
There's in the psychological world, in that world where you get a PhD and you go that route and you diagnose people, and maybe prescribe drugs. In that world, there's two types of empathy and maybe some in-betweens, but the two types are affective empathy, which is the more emotional empathy, which is, I think, what most people think of when they think of empathy, like that you're feeling what other people feel or something along those lines.
Yeah, that would have been my definition. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then there's
I would have said it's whereas sympathy is being able to have condolence or have compassion for what someone is experiencing. I thought, at least I was taught, empathy is where you take it a step further and you feel that person's pain as if it were your own. That way you become more relatable because you can experience what they're going through. You feel it as if it was your own pain. Mm-hmm. But sorry, I just wanted to define.
No, that's great. That's actually probably more common in terms of people that aren't trained in these things. Because and it's annoying when I get psychologists or psychiatrists or therapists coming to my groups because they tend to want to teach everybody. Yeah. But okay, so there's cognitive, which is the other. Okay, so affective, which I mentioned, which is the emotional empathy that, where you're feeling as much as a person can, differing degrees per person. You're feeling what other people feel. And then there is, and we'll get into sympathy. And then there is cognitive empathy, where you're imagining what they feel. And you're really trying to understand, and it's a much more heady or heady kind of, intellectual pursuit. It's much more mental than heart. Okay.
Sure.
And so you can't see them as distinct. They do have overlap. And I found practicing both that you can practice cognitive empathy where you're just really like, they're feeling this way and da da da. And you maybe can't even help but feel a little bit of it yourself, or and it's like a memory, or even like just putting yourself in their shoes, right?
Sure.
Because that's what you're doing. And that can, and for me, it often does, if I choose to let it lead me to where maybe, to the emotional empathy, where my eyes will start to get a little watery and throat constricted or whatever, right? And then you might feel this really much more deeper connection with the person that you're empathizing with.
Sure.
Okay, so then there's sympathy. Okay, so for now I'm going to depart. Okay, sympathy, from what I understand, as far as the more dictionary way of looking at it, is simpatico. It's feeling. So where empathy is the emotional empathy is feeling with somebody, and then sympathy is feeling with somebody. Apologies. So it's more like I have felt what you have felt, and I'm really identifying with you because I have experienced that, or I am right now.
That's interesting. Because I would have thought
Yeah.
that was more empathy. Because I thought in order to give sympathy, you don't necessarily need to relate to what someone is going through. I mean, I didn't. For instance, I would always give my condolences to people, give sympathies when they'd lost a loved one, and I didn't know what it felt like until I had lost a loved one. But it was still something I just give to them because I realized that they were in remorse, and I wanted them to feel that I cared. But I didn't necessarily relate to it. But go on. I just found that an interesting definition. Yeah.
The thing is, that's closer to the way I define them in my book, in this practical empathy system, is where empathy is more an understanding of how others feel and even how you feel inside. And then and I'm using sympathy to be more of what you're saying, more of a feeling with somebody, and a broader way of defining it, sort of like I see the way you're defining it as being kind of broad.
Yeah, great. So how does having a deeper sense of empathy, I mean, how does that benefit your life?
Oh,
how's it
that's a
benefit
big
your
question.
life?
Yeah, you'll probably need to interrupt me, but okay, starting out with self empathy, I think that's where it's really important that people learn how to look inside and identify their feelings and identify the underlying values or needs that are driving those feelings. I'll give you an example that's kind of an easy one for me. It's because I share it in the groups all the time as an exercise. I'm like, here, you guys want a takeaway that's solid that you could take with you and practice this? And do you ever get upset in traffic? Because I think a lot of people do, right?
Sure.
And to varying degrees. And, maybe my thing would be people tailing me, like getting right up on my ass. And I'm not driving slow. I like driving fast. But somebody getting right up on my ass and maybe just doing dangerous things. But I tend to, and then I find that a lot of people, there's two different underlying needs. Like there's anger or frustration at the top as a feeling, but the needs or values that are driving that feeling, if we look inside ourselves, might be either a need for safety or a need for consideration/respect. And just over the hundreds of groups I've done over the last 9 years, I found that it tends to be, men tend to go more with respect, consideration, where females tend to go more with safety. And to me, it makes sense. I actually am one of those weirdos that believe there's differences in sexes, that we're, equivalent. But okay, so here's the exercise. It's like I'm cruising along. Somebody does this thing, right? And I'm like, oh man, I'm really pissed off. There's me identifying that's not too hard. And then I'm like, you know what? I wanted more consideration there for I wanted them to, or more awareness, right? And that sort of recognizing what I wanted more of that I did not get brings responsibility on me more not all the way, because they did do something to stimulate my feelings, right? But so there's a big component of responsibility here, but we'll put that aside for a second. So that maybe I have to do that 100 times before then I'm loose enough with it or feeling generous enough or whatever to be able to then do it for them. So there I've got to make up a story where it's like, well, maybe that person was in a big rush because they had a pregnant wife in the trunk and they're trying to get her to the hospital, right? Or maybe they were late to work and they were told by their boss, if they're late one more time, they're going to be fired. And so what were their needs? Maybe that was security, like job security. Maybe it was, and I think that, of course, that's a great mental exercise or imagination exercise, but more than that, we're exercising letting go of this, and I believe that repetition, like any kind of, exercise, I think that it can change us. And eventually your brain, instead of going through those steps, your brain looks for shortcuts. And it's like, you know what? Every time this happens, I end up in this place of peace and forgiveness, or I don't really like the word forgiveness because it assumes somebody was doing something wrong. But basically, I end up in this place of peace and acceptance. So why not just go straight there? And for me, that's worked. And I have actually more and more nowadays students from way back coming to me and saying, you know what? That shit does work.
Sure. Well, one thing I've always thought is that things like empathy are things that you typically learn as you interact with people by virtue that we're the kind of beings that feel other people's pain by virtue of being alive. For instance, I find a lot of animals I interact with, for instance, dogs. I love the fact that dogs are so attuned to human beings, even though they haven't been taught, obviously, in a school as to how to be attuned to them. And I'd say that they express a form of empathy by knowing that when you're sad, I mean, anyone that has a dog knows their dog notices a lot of their emotions, better than a lot of people do. And is there an aspect of this that you think is just intuitive? Because I would think that part of being an empathic person is just having gone through enough experiences and having been around enough people to identify, to see, feel intuitively when someone else is going through something. And as a result, you change your behavior to accommodate what they're going through. Because you mentioned that with cognitive empathy, one of the things that I wanted to just push back just in regards to the idea behind that I was a little kind of jaded about is that you're trying to put yourself in a situation, trying to relate logically from a left brain approach, trying to imagine what someone is going through. And in my mind, I guess this is more the intuitive route. I feel like you just feel it intuitively, like that a dog knows that you're in pain because it sees you. I don't think it needs to make a conscious effort to try to put himself in that situation. But maybe there is a bit of both that's required. But how much of empathy, I guess just to state my question, do you think is a learned trait intuitively or versus it being something that needs to be taught?
Oh, yeah. I love that question. It brings up a lot of ideas. And I guess I'll begin with how I was having a talk with some friends recently. I asked them, do you think humans are innately good? And
now we're going deep into the philosophical aspect of the nature of our being and whatnot. This is what I love to get into on the Krishool Journey.
So
let's do it.
I'm imagining caveman days, tribal days, and we had these small interdependent groups that it was very survival oriented. And what I imagine is evolution from there was all about, those who contributed to the tribe, who cared for others and not just cared in their minds and hearts, but showed it, like did the caring, that they were the ones who fed the tribe, literally, and survived. And those tribes survived. And this is, I don't know, I'm not a, evolutionary biologist or I'm not a specialist in that kind of culture, but I just imagine that it is a deep part of our genetics to be good to others, to even feel pain when we see another person stumble and of course there are the outliers, right? But I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the average human. And so I think it's hardwired into us to be empathetic, and to, imagine how that person feels, like I just said. And I think that our modern culture, food, you could sum it up with environment, but I would say food, schooling, parenting, drugs, and by drugs I mean mostly prescription drugs, like the shit that they give the vaccines, all these things, and technology. Okay, and I'm a programmer, by the way. I'm a software designer, and
join
developer.
the crew, brother. Software engineering. Yeah, that's what I did. Yeah, go on.
So all of that, I think, is like it dampens our empathy. I am out and about a lot, and I meet a lot of people, and they come to my groups, and I walk a lot and drive a lot and all that. And what I see over the past 10 years, but then it's been ramping up really fast, is less empathy, less awareness, less, and more in younger generations, but I'm seeing it everywhere. I'm seeing this, and from those reasons I just mentioned.
Absolutely. I emphatically agree with everything you're saying. I think it's common knowledge that the more empathy you have, the more well-liked you tend to be. I mean, I always found in high school, and I think it's pretty universal, that the people that have the most amount of friends, they tend to do better in terms of success, power. In order to have congruence, you need people to like you. That being said, where does it make sense that by understanding what people are going through, by being able to relate to them and so forth, chances are they're more going to be inclined to like you, and that helps you surviving, whether you're building a community in order to survive a harsh winter, or you're running for the leader of some political party or something like that. That makes sense. But here's the thing. So here is the caveat. There are a lot of people, you probably heard of them, that are sociopaths or psychopaths. And the idea, at least in I think the psychopath, is that you can feign feeling what other people are feeling, and you pretend to understand what they're going through. You're very relatable. So they've mastered the art of faking sympathy, making people think that they actually care about them, but in reality, they don't have any empathy. They don't actually feel. And when I use the word empathy, just to clarify this, I'm talking about people don't really feel pain as if it was their own. So someone can do the most horrific acts and they don't really care. Now, of course, they'll pretend that they care. Oh my God, I can't believe that. I can't believe I hurt you, but deep down they feel nothing. Because my understanding of this is that the reason why a lot of people hate harming other people is because they feel the pain as if it was their own. That's one of the things that I've always felt towards animals. I mean, granted, we extend this towards our own family, sometimes our own tribe, our race, and so forth. I think the whole idea of casting a wider net is something that we do if we want to become more connected. This is the spiritual outlook, right? So you cast this attitude of empathy towards animals because you feel that they feel pain as if it was your own. But there are some people that are so disconnected from that they feign this response, and then they end up getting into places of power. They talk the talk, but they are completely psychopathic in that they don't have the capacity to feel, and therefore they try to manipulate other people. So by all means, they come across as empathetic, but they're not actually empathetic. And I think I think it's important to make a distinction between those people, because I think there are a lot of people that show all the characteristics of being very relatable, act as if they're empathic, but if you don't actually feel someone's pain, because I think this is the salient distinction here. If you don't actually feel someone's pain as if it was your own, you don't have the capacity to do that. That means you're just acting like a robot, and you're just carrying out these behavioral traits in order to elicit a response to get what you want. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have mixed thoughts on that. I do get where you're coming from, as in that if we're not feeling what others feel, then that's a recipe for just I like that you use the term robot. We're just living our lives and potentially being destructive because we don't have anything holding us back potentially from being destructive. You didn't mention being destructive, and I kind of like that, actually, because I think there's this stigma that if you're a psychopath or sociopath, you're doing destructive things. And, part of me, this part that is values fairness, wants to speak out against that and say, that I think intelligence, along with that heart you're talking about, can make a difference. And it's one of the arguments that I make, a brief sidetrack that is relevant. I've made this argument forever, as people have said, AI means doomsday, right? And one of the defenses I would make for AI would be this. It comes from voluntarism. You might recognize this, and it's
Sure.
not, I don't know the exact quote or whatever, but the idea that the more intelligent you are. You have a quote?
No. I was going to go somewhere else, but I'll let you go where I realized you're going somewhere else with this.
Well,
so go on.
That violence is expensive.
Okay. Elaborate on that.
So sort of like peaceful solutions have less cost, or and by cost I mean now and later, kind of, or definitely later. And I think maybe violence has this temptation for some, if they're dumb or if they don't know how to look into the future at all, then that seems like the more beneficial thing is the violence, right?
So is that alluding to the idea that AI, if it truly is intelligent, is going to take the path of least resistance and not want to take over all of humanity? Because a lot of people, when they think of the negative consequences of AI, they think that this thing could become like Skynet and realize eventually that human beings aren't necessary, and as a result just delete them. But you're saying, based off of this rationale that violence is expensive, that ultimately it'd cost a lot more pain, destruction, to net negative energy to destroy human beings. And I think a lot of the overarching rulers of this this planet, in terms of their behavior, a lot of the things that have been done throughout history, might disagree with you, because the argument that is often made, and correct me if I'm wrong, feel free to, I love it more when people contradict my statements, and they have really good arguments against it. Because what I would say is, throughout history, we've seen the argument being made that it's necessary to destroy certain groups because there's scarcity. We need to compete for the resources, and we need to get rid of certain people because they're a threat, because they're going to make this world a worse place. It's the utilitarian argument. It's for the greater good. And I actually thought you were going down the route of when you were going to, when you said violence is expensive, I actually thought you were going to make the libertarian argument that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, because a lot of people think that it's a good idea to censor artificial intelligence, to put all these restrictions, which we're already doing, that essentially erode people's freedom, their ability to use technology and so forth, because potentially it is so destructive if we allow these technologies to continue. I mean, obviously AI can be used for cyber warfare. It's already being applied to military technology. The 6th generation fighter jets are going to be essentially AI, not drones, because they're operated by people, but essentially AI unmanned craft that are autonomous, essentially use some kind of a like hive-like AI drone-like system that they're not being controlled by anyone to essentially navigate, and they're proving to be, according to the ace fighter pilots, better. So in terms of the potential for this technology to be very destructive, it is, I think, likely. And the argument is that it's much better, I think, to have violence in the short while, because it's going to prevent a lot of destruction in the future. I think this is what history has shown us. At least this, I don't actually believe this, right? But this is the argument that has been made by a lot of the tyrants to do all the horrible things that they do. It's for the greater good. Let's wipe out. Well, that's what they're doing right now, right? We got to wipe out this amount of the population because the planet Earth won't be able to sustain that. As to whether or not it's true, though, that's the question. I think it might be the case that violence is actually more, it's less cost effective in the long run.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we're in agreement. If you're looking for a debate there, it's not
I'm actually just eager to hear any thoughts.
I mean,
they don't have to contradict.
But I'll be clear, because you were displaying a differing point of view.
Okay.
As I believe, like that, the way you started it was certain, world leaders and powerful people have these ideas that violence is the right way, get rid of certain people, restrict this and that.
Hamas,
I
they got
mean,
to go, right? That whole thing, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
you could predict my answers if you just, I'm a voluntarist.
I know, but
I'm a anarcho-capitalist.
we're making this is for the audience as well.
Um,
Like, I want people to
yeah,
get
yeah, yeah,
something
yeah,
out of this.
totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I lean pretty far toward people not having power over other people, so that they can make decisions to start wars, etc. Now, as far as all those war machines you're talking about and the
Mm.
way AI is being weaponized, yeah, that's happening and it sucks. But I don't think that restricting its use in other areas is going to help. In other words, I don't believe that a blanket, and I don't think you can blanket regulate AI, because for various reasons. For one, it's not one thing. A lot of times I think people, and I'll do it myself, when it's them. And I'm glad, because to me, that's sort of like competition, and
Mm.
there's going to be bad ones. There's going to be good ones. There's going to be ones used by bad people. There's going to be ones used by good people. And I hope it balances out, and we can't know for sure. And there isn't in my opinion, there is not a guarantee of anything ever. It's like with my new clients, I'm like, hey, if this doesn't work out, like, I don't believe in making a contract that says you're going to have to keep me on board even if you don't like me. It's a freedom of association or disassociation. Sure. But I'm drifting from the point.
Future's unknown. No, you bring up some salient points there. And can I just add, one of the things I loved about your book is I read it from cover to cover, and I actually took notes, but I've actually discarded them all because I wanted to have like an open conversation. I didn't want it to be robotic, which is actually another point that I was going to make in regards to the approach of this practical empathy. The idea of, but I'll get to that a bit later, because the point I wanted to make here was one, empathy. If we get to the heart of empathy, whereas I think you would argue that it is beneficial to, and correct me if I'm wrong, to understand what someone is experiencing, it's always better to understand where they're coming from. Do you think it can be taken too far? Because my whole approach is that if you are being completely in line with who you are, who you are, you're not willing to bend to anyone's thoughts. This is in the realm of ethics, morality, or something like that. If we're in a situation where you have this definitive idea that what someone has done is absolutely unacceptable, like let's take the worst thing, for instance, right? Just to illustrate my point, you have committed genocide. You're dropping bombs on thousands of people in some part of the Middle East. No, actually, that's
what are you accusing me of?
No. I'm trying to. No, actually, let me use a more less argumentative point here. Okay,
whatever.
Child sacrifice. All right. Now, if you try to understand the perspective of someone that condones that using empathy, is there a point where you say, well, it doesn't matter the fact that I understand where you're coming from. I'm not going to change my behavior. I still think that you need to be in prison. Because I think this idea, and correct me if I'm wrong if this isn't the idea that's been perpetuated, right? But I feel like it points to it with the concept that empathy, maybe, I don't think you necessarily said this, but perhaps it's in my mind, the idea that empathy is always the right path, because it's not necessary all the time to understand where someone is coming from if what they've done is objectively wrong. Because I truly feel that there are certain things that are unforgivable. And whereas even if I did understand where you're coming from, like you committed child sacrifices or you wanted to perform genocide and so forth, it shouldn't change my behavior in the way that I behave. Like, because to me, it's not always about understanding where someone comes from. But I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on that. Because do you think there are any things that shouldn't require empathy in terms of the way that you behave, or changing the way you behave? You understand what I'm saying?
So, oh, completely. I get this quite often from people who have read the book or come to the groups, and they wonder this. It makes sense. It's like, wait a minute, where's that line? If somebody's committed murder or they've stolen from you, or
I understand
just
where you're
anything.
From. Yeah, I could have done that in your situation. No, fuck. Give me my money back, bro.
Yeah. So, and the thing is, acceptance in my system, at least, is tied very closely to empathy, and we practice both, really, and they're tight. So I do make it very clear in the book but only maybe in one or two spots. That, because this is important, acceptance does not mean condoning. Acceptance does not mean agreement. It doesn't necessarily mean those things. It can, you can agree and accept, but you can accept and reject in terms of you can accept that this is a thing that humans do. So I'm not going to get all bent out of shape and say, wait a minute, I can't believe that person did that. You ever hear people, you ever hear people say that?
Sure.
Like, oh, I can't believe she wore that dress with that shirt, or I can't. And it's like, well, why? Because it happened. And also humans do these things. So accept it. You know, a person murdered somebody, accept it, you know, and fight it if you want to. So absolutely. And then this, what, I don't know if that part, I want to pause there. There's some related things I want to talk about, but really let's have, you know, I don't know what you think of that, what I said so far.
No, I agree with you. And you actually made that point in your book. And I very much understand that the distinctions between understanding, maybe acknowledging, I'm not sure if you use that particular word, why someone does what they do doesn't necessarily mean that you condone it and so forth. And I wanted to make a point here before I forget, because I heard Sam Harris make a point in a podcast. I don't often agree with a lot of the things that he said, but this actually empathically allowed me to understand where he was coming from. And I actually really resonated with the point here. When he went on to define what evil was in some podcast, he made the point that in his mind, and I really appreciated this definition, when he puts himself in the position of someone else, and he can't imagine under any circumstances him behaving in that way, doing that thing which that person did, that's what he calls evil. And that to me is the empathy argument, right? Because the idea of empathy is that when you understand where someone is coming from and you can see their perspective, the general idea is you tend to have a lot more compassion, right? I find that with empathic behavior, that tends to bring about more compassion. Not necessarily, but I think this is a common thing you'll find. But when people can't conceive of how someone could behave that way, that's when they're inclined to have a big grievance with their behavior. And regardless of how empathic they are, they look at that and they call that behavior evil. Does that make sense? At least I understood from his statement that that's how a lot of people look at it. And I can understand empathically, I can respect that argument.
Yeah, it makes a certain kind of sense, but at the same, I very much disagree. My first thoughts are judgments that they are making judgments based on their lack of imagination. So, but let me make sure I understood what you just said.
Yeah.
That he's basically saying if he can't empathize with somebody because they're so alien, what they just did or what they're thinking.
Yeah. Can I
he calls that evil? Yeah.
Yeah. I absolutely. I just wanted to add though, just because when we're using empathy, he means like by putting himself in the same shoes as that person, he can't imagine him ever doing in that situation, going through their life, behaving that way. And I want you to address that because that's
okay.
Yeah,
you can't imagine doing the actions they did. That
so essentially what you said, but just to clarify,
okay. So to a lesser degree, I still believe that that's maybe just lacking imagination, and because I don't know if this is right or not for me to just say, well, there could be so many situations where somebody does something that he considers wrong, but he doesn't know the full story. I don't know. Were kind of
I love this because I got this understanding of your worldview reading your book. And I think this point surmises it. And correct me if I'm wrong, because the understanding is that essentially we're all connected. We are all one. I think this is a very Eastern idea. And if we put ourselves into the same position as someone else, if we have the imagination, we have the intuition, the metis, the sagacity, call it what you will, we should be able to, on some level, empathize, understand, realize that person is not entirely evil. Maybe this is me just being fluffy with my words, but essentially you wouldn't have such a negative perspective if you put yourself in the shoes of that person. And whereas there is a part of me that respects this. One of my favorite books, actually, How to Win Friends and Influence People. This is it's like a bestseller by Dale Carnegie. One of the points was, at least that stuck in my mind, was this point that ultimately when you're trying to understand someone, because this is one of the ways that you make yourself more, you influence people, right? Which is the same effect that empathy has, right? Because the whole book is around how to like essentially make friends, influence people to be a powerful person without being fake. And when you can put yourself in the same position as someone, you're able to do that. But his point was that ultimately you have to realize that if you went through exactly the same life that someone has, you were that same person, you had the same relationships and so forth, you would behave just the same way that they would. That was the statement that he made. That was the rationale that he came about with by making the observation, right? Making the statement initially before he made the evaluation, which is another point that you bring about in your book, the distinction between observations and evaluations, which I think is really a really important point, which we'll get into. But he's made the conclusion that if we essentially went through the same thing as someone else did, that we would essentially behave the same way. So ultimately, that allows you to be more empathic. I disagree in that, just based off of my understanding, call it religion, call it awareness, what you will, I don't believe that whereas I believe that ultimately we are connected, we cannot be the same entity. There are some people that are always going to be different. I truly believe that I could put myself in the same body, same experiences as someone else, and I would have a different, I would make different decisions. And as a result, I don't accept that worldview.
Nice. Yeah. And that what that brings up for me as well as smiling is, you've probably encountered this, people who believe, highly intelligent people believe that, and who can know for sure, but believe that everything is predetermined and you have no choice.
Yeah.
And that to me it's like, wait a minute, if we don't know one way or the other for sure, why not choose to believe that you have choice?
Yeah. I'm not sure if you know this, but I interviewed a guy that wrote a book called Are We Biological Robots? That was in contradiction to the well-established idea that determinism is scientifically proven, right? And he uses the most brilliant arguments to disprove this, and it's directly opposed to what Sam Harris and many of the scientific establishment is saying. But we spoke about this topic. I highly recommend checking out the work of, his name's David Lawrence, but the podcast, he's on a lot of podcasts. He released this book maybe a year ago, but it was so brilliant because he uses reason and logic to illustrate something called the performative contradiction. Because people that try to argue against the idea of free will, I mean, what's the point of arguing anyway? I mean, by actually arguing, you're contradicting this idea that you can't control it, and more often than not, these people show these performative contradictions in their own behavior in so many of the things they say. And he uses reason and logic. And I found myself loving disagreeing with this guy, because I would constantly be seeing just the irrationalities of the arguments I would make, that because I do appreciate when people make solid arguments. But I guess I just wanted to just go off on a tangent and address that, because you were speaking about free will. But I'm not sure how this related to our conversation, but just, I guess, just the idea of not having free will. I think this perhaps goes to the heart of the conversation we were having, as to your worldview and so forth. I think that if you believe that is a choice, that we are free agents, that we're not just subject to determinism, you believe that we cannot all be the same. And as a result, it's not always incumbent upon us to realize that we could have done exactly the same thing, because there are some people that behave in ways that we don't necessarily condone, because we're just very different. Maybe that philosophically isn't enticing, but that perhaps there is truth in that. Yeah.
I mean, that distinction, right? That brings up a distinction in my head. Like, I don't think empathy has to be, it can be put yourself in their shoes to feel what they are feeling now, but not to excuse what they did, because it's not about blame or anything.
Sure.
It's in my view, it's much more mechanistic / practical, maybe even stoic in a way, where it's like, okay, they did these things. I'm choosing not to engage the heart empathy, I am using my cognitive empathy to understand and accept that humans do these things, not that I would have in their shoes. So there's my distinction when you bring up the whole, okay, if I had grown up like I had had all the stimuli, would I have made the same choices? I don't even look at that.
Okay.
It's great though. You brought that to mind. It's something I never even thought of.
Yeah. That's that bro, this conversation is deep. I'm enjoying this. Oh, okay. So here's something I wanted to throw out there. So one of the things I loved reading in your book is as just a mental exercise, because whereas it was very, I'd say your book, I think it's fair to say, it was very left brain. It's very kind of very which I'm going to tangent here. This is another just
That's
a little
fine. Yeah, I
like
love
the
it.
whole approach of consciously learning how to become empathic and finding ways to have a conversation. And you address this. One of the criticisms that it can come across as very inorganic, like the idea of trying to have a conversation using some of the approaches. For someone like me that is very much into the whole idea of just being natural flow state, organic conversations, like I personally hate it when I notice someone is behaving in a way that is not natural. Like they've gone and done this forum, right? Like I have a lot of these friends that have done something called Landmark, and they'd all come out
Oh
of it.
yeah.
Oh yeah. And they'd all speak
Oh.
in a certain way. And because they were still trying to incorporate this into their way of being, it just seems so fake when I would like, even when they try, like I had a friend that tried to get me to do this thing. And just the way
Mm,
that he went about trying to do it, like, bro, I'll pay for you to do this. Like, what really? And I was
mm.
like, that's not. And I learned that it was just something they were told to say to their friends as a way of trying to get and to get them to do it. And I just felt like that person was being inorganic because it's like they were saying something that I thought was disingenuous and that it wasn't really something they would say, but they were using that as a tool to try to get me to react a certain way. And my point is not to get caught up on the whole landmark thing, but
Ah,
anytime someone is adopting attitudes, it feels less like I'm connected to them because they're
authentic.
using a language, they're using terms, they're using something that's very unnatural to communicate. And I feel as if I'm being sold to, as opposed to just having a conversation with someone where we're like, yeah, we're not so caught up about being perfect. It feels like a real heart level connection, as opposed to I'm trying to use the right words to elicit this response to get you to behave in a certain kind of way, which to me becomes manipulation. It's not that it's deceptive, but it's used in order to elicit a response. It's being
Mhm.
telic, right? Which is opposed to paratelic, which I love, which is a state of being where you're not concerned about the outcome. And it's not that either are good or bad, but I find that the best interactions I have with people are when we're not trying to get anywhere. It's just, it goes where it goes.
Spontaneous.
Absolutely. And that was the one criticism I know you get a lot between trying to formulate these tools in your book. But I know you've made the point. I guess I'll let you make it now as to why you think it's still beneficial to take on that approach of consciously learning these tools.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Well, I guess I look at it like how it's formulaic when you are learning it. You're learning to integrate it. And to me, it's so I studied and eventually taught Kung Fu for many years.
Oh wow.
And there is a formulaicness when you're learning it. There are forms and you do these, it's like a dance.
I love this. Go on.
You learn
Yeah,
hundreds of these dances, and
sure.
each dance can be minutes long or whatever and have many movements. Or let's say you're learning what I would love to learn is piano. Same thing. You've got, this formula. And so to me, it's just this discipline, this way that I have a feeling many aspects of life, many art forms, many whatever, pursuits that we do, it is useful to do something repetitively and formulaically, and until we have gained some sort of mastery where we can let go and be spontaneous and play and enjoy ourselves and be natural with it.
Absolutely. That is such a salient point. Obviously, you have to be willing to make mistakes, to fall before you learn how to walk. And as you were even saying that, I realized, touche, you're 100% right. Whereas there is an emotional part of me that gets agitated when I feel like someone's not being real, but the fact that you need to practice it is shouldn't prevent you from feeling as if you shouldn't behave like that just because some people might kill you. Because as you're saying, like, and I love the fact that you use kung fu as the analogy for this, because one of my favorite kung fu practitioners, Bruce Lee, would often say that you must learn to become unnaturally natural. Well, that's
okay.
another one. Yeah, but the idea is that, and it's a Confucianist idea. Dao Zhu said you must. I don't want to. I'll just paraphrase. Basically, he said that you must learn the masculine but go with the feminine. And it's this idea that the masculine is the logical, the left brain. Like, you initially start to learn something, and then eventually you reach the point where you don't have to be in the left brain. You can just go with the flow state. That's just when you're with the feminine, the intuitive mind. And unnaturally natural is you do something that is very unnatural initially. This is what Bruce Lee said, right? And eventually it no longer becomes a natural. It is a part of you. You no longer think about needing to have fixed forms, go through these katas and so forth. And Bruce Lee said the ultimate technique is to have no technique as technique. So that's like the whole water thing, to become like water, ultimately to transcend this idea of forms, to transcend this idea of needing to be in line with any modality, which is the goal. And in order to get to the goal, you need to have the way, the approach. So I very much respect that. It's just I'm sure you've been in situations where you have a conversation with someone, and like I know girls have experienced this, because for any girls that have been around pickup artists, this is something I used to have a massive issue with. A lot of them, they use these techniques that seem as if they're just running through lines, and they use this to talk to women. And it just feels like I didn't even know what pickup artistry was when I first saw a friend of mine doing this shit. And I just thought he was a really bad actor. And I remember thinking to myself, what is this? And I realized that later on, because another friend was telling me that what he was doing was part of this technique from this book, right? And everything that he laid out was exactly this person. I'm like, oh my God, no wonder, because this guy was acting, was behaving in a way that wasn't organic, as opposed to just having a conversation, being in a state of flow, or being so brilliant. Like, this is what comedians do that I love. I've learned a lot of comedians don't even, it seems as if everything they're doing is spontaneous, but they actually have a lot of that stuff planned out. And as a result, it seems as if it's fluidic, but it's not. So I guess, I know I'm going around here, but I guess my biggest criticism, which I know you get a lot, is just the approach of having to learn something. But like with anything, whether you're learning piano or you're being a master, if you want to become a master, it comes with effort, I guess it's fair to say, right?
Yeah. So my system, practical empathy,
Yeah.
I developed as a bridge between the system I studied for many years that another person developed, Marshall Rosenberg. It was called nonviolent communication, NVC. And after reading that book and then rereading it many times, just being blown away by it, and my system's very similar. I only changed a few things, to make it easier, more accessible, etc.
Sure.
So I came away from his system with it was very clinical, and I spoke in a very clinical, robotic way that was just, it came across, it wasn't inauthentic, that wasn't the intent, but it wasn't an intent to manipulate, but people assume that, like a lot of people did, because I was slow, because I was processing. It was before integration happened, and I was constantly processing and trying to ask them the empathy in a very specific way, and not in a more conversation. So one of the many reasons that I developed my system and wrote my book is because I wanted people to have an easy way, a way that would not scare everybody away when they're, like their friends and stuff. Like, look, here's some tips that you can use to gradually, like, for example, warn somebody. It's like, hey, babe, it's like, I really want to talk to you about this, but not get in our typical argument. And I've been studying this thing. Do you mind if I try this it might sound kind of weird, I mean, but so warn people and let them know what you're doing or whatever. And yeah, there's a lot of little tips I put in there. Because the goal, I mean, and I want to share with you if it's okay, like one of the other reasons I wrote it and I think you'll really identify with this, is I mean, to me, libertarianism, the small L, which is like the umbrella for voluntarism, etc.
Okay.
Libertarianism, one of the deeper principles is that we take responsibility, right? And not only for our own situation, but our own feelings. Like we don't go around pointing the finger and saying, you need to shut up because I can't take what you're saying, right?
Sure.
And so to me, there's been what I've noticed over the past, I don't know, X number of years is a decrease in people wanting to take responsibility. And I think that's actually one of the principles underlying socialism and even, many forms of tyranny, is this idea that, hey, you don't have to be responsible. No individual is responsible. The collective is responsible, right?
Absolutely.
And so one of my bigger reasons for doing this, for doing the groups, for spreading this, is to get underneath, because I'll have people come to my groups, and the groups are called Practical Empathy Play Group. And as you can probably imagine, it brings a lot of super left-leaning people, hippies, etc. And I think of myself as a hippie, but just not that kind.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so
it's just changed, man, over the last 20, 30 years, like
it has.
Yeah, absolutely. But I hear you.
So they come, and I love blowing their minds, because I'll ask them things like, because they'll be bitching about something, because I'm inviting everybody to share their thing. And I don't attack them. I ask questions, and I'll be like, so are you more powerful when you point the finger and you say, hey, that person did or said this thing, and, it's out of my control. They did or said this, but my control is to try to control them. And so am I more powerful when that's what I'm doing? Or am I more powerful when I think to myself, well, what could I do different? How could I interpret that? How can I understand them?
Absolutely. I respect that so much. And that's probably the biggest thing I got out of your book was it allowed me to be very introspective and looking at some of my own behaviors and a lot of the ways that you would break down social interactions and so forth got me to understand why something could be very confrontational. And the biggest word that comes to my mind that I got, looking at a lot of your stuff, just the way in which you try to address these issues and handle situations is trying to have clarity, like the questions that you ask, because I like the idea of, rather than saying that someone is wrong, trying to understand or get them to see how they got to the conclusion that they got to, by getting them to analyze what they've said, what they mean. One of the points that you made, which I often, I actually have a big pet peeve about, and I don't refer to it in the way that you refer to it, but just how people often make evaluations or judgments, right? Which I call pseudo-profundities, as opposed to observations. And I love the fact that you were talking about how initially the book that inspired you writing this book had to do with nonviolent communication. Because I think some of the biggest arguments arise from misunderstandings people have in the way in which they use language. For instance, synecdoche is one of them, how people often generalize and they try to make the actions of one person represent the whole, or vice versa, so forth. Or when people make claims about what they think someone is thinking, or what they think something means, as opposed to what someone has said. Like, you make a point about observations versus evaluations, and this may seem very esoteric or very just too much information to people, but I think it's such a relevant point, because so much of the disagreements that people have come about from them not being able to delineate between what words mean, understanding, like when people accusing you of having said something, or as opposed to what your actions mean. Like that, this is a big one for me. Often I get accused of meaning something when I've said something that didn't actually imply that, Like there's this classic scene from a Jordan Peterson interview where I can't remember which one it was, but you might remember this. Like, it went viral about this woman that was interviewing Jordan Peterson. She was constantly saying, oh, you know her name. I think that was her. But it was a situation where she was saying, she was saying what he said implied. Oh, so you think that women don't have any rights? Like, she didn't necessarily say that, but she was making all of these evaluations based on him saying the most subtle points that had nothing to do with that. And it's a very violent form of communication. And I hate using the word violent, because it's not obviously objective like physical violence, but it's a way of bringing about more disagreement when you are phrasing things like that. And one of the things about your book that really stuck to me was some of the tactics you can use in trying to have clarity and understanding. And in my mind, I've always looked at that as being different to empathy, but perhaps in the realm of what you call cognitive empathy, trying to put yourself in the situation, understand what they're thinking and how you can phrase things in a way to mediate a better response. It's very relevant. And I think this is a very important tool in conflict resolution and essentially bringing about the best societies, because so many of the issues that I've had, whether in relationships or just in general, I think in politics, have to do with people not understanding what each other mean and not knowing how to phrase their arguments in the right kind of way. And you don't have to be disingenuous, I think, to do that. But yeah, feel free to cut in if I'm ranting too much, because sometimes I just go on and on. But yeah, did you have the perspective coming into writing this book that you wanted to essentially create tools to allow people to mediate the disagreements they have better? I mean, was that like a big part of it? Was it more? I mean, what were some of the goals that you were trying to achieve there?
Yeah, mediation is one part. Helping people better understand themselves and thus understand others better, communicate more clearly. I like that you brought that up. To me, clarity is super important. Like I go out of my way, I like to think I go out of my way to not use excessive pronouns, for example. And like if I'm telling you a story and I say, yeah, and then he did this to him, and then that guy did that, and then this guy did this, and you're like, wait a minute, who is who and who did what?
Oh, sure. Yeah, confusion.
So
yeah.
I will actually be somewhat redundant. I'll be like, okay, so Frank did this to so and so, and then Frank did this, rather than using. But that's a very practical, not necessarily along the lines of empathy, but it can be if you think. I mean, if I'm gonna be real like reaching, then you could say, well, I'm trying to be considerate and understand how another person might process. For example, when I show a time progression, I go like this rather than, so my, what's natural to me is to think, oh, here and then here and then here in a time progression as a Westerner, right? But I have conditioned myself to go here and then here and then here because I'm describing it to somebody in front of me, so they see it going left to right.
Okay. Yeah, subtle things like that. You see, I find all that stuff really fascinating because I'm very interested in NLP psychology, and whereas a lot of people think that these things deal with manipulation, and which they often can. A lot of the times you can use these ways to benefit people. For instance, using certain language to nullify a very violent conversation, and just the most subtle things. Like, so I know of some classic examples where someone has given a speech and it has been received so positively by an audience, and then the same speech has been given by a woman, all right, in a more subtle tone. And the first time was actually received very negatively, and then it was given by a man. The man has a very harsh way of speaking, and then the lady actually gave the same speech. Like, it's a well-known speech by Gary Yourofsky. He's an animal rights activist, but essentially it laid completely differently when the woman gave the speech, because the way in which we use inflections, our intonation, I think even the way that people write, the way that people structure their sentences sometimes does have the ability to be received in a completely different way. I think it's a lot harder to have a whole range of different emotions when you're using text. That's why I've trained myself. One of the things I always try to do is, if I have an argument, I will always try to have it over the phone or in person if possible, as opposed to text. Because I don't know about you, but so many of the disagreements that I've had have always started from text-based conversations, and it's with someone I imagine them to get frustrated, angry, and they respond in a very negative way, where they make, say things in a way that can be very triggering, untrue, or they make generalizations. And or what's worse is you misinterpret what they've actually said. You don't see the subtext in what they have written, and as a result, you have the wrong attitude to what they've said. And I think this is all relevant, and I think it all falls under the umbrella of empathy. One of the things I found really interesting about your book is I had a very one-dimensional understanding of empathy, but your book has kind of broadened it to encompass so many things that I think are useful in not just conflict resolution, but in how to navigate relationships and so forth. And yeah, I commend you on that. I think you've done a great job with that.
Feels good to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, one other thing I just wanted to bring up here, because I actually had all these notes, even though I was going to look at them, and I be remiss if I didn't bring this up. So you made a point, and I think this applies to the real world, where people in the approach that they're using to be more empathic and so forth, they always opt for being positive. I think this is the point I wanted to make. So you were talking about the people that are being fake in a positive way. Like, a lot of the times they'll opt for a behavior that will, in order to elicit a beneficial response, is very optimistic, speak in a very optimistic way about something, when in reality, in truth, it's to me, it comes across as very disingenuous. And I guess I'm not even sure if this falls under the category of empathy, but this is just a side note, which I really related to. This whole attitude of smiling, people being smiling depressants, about being positive about everything. Like I've suffered from doing this, where in a situation where someone's gone through the worst thing ever, I'm being optimistic. My whole thing is I want to make people either smile, laugh, or inspire people, when I'm not being the irritating person that's dropping truth bombs and whatnot. And I often opt for saying things that may not necessarily be true, but are positive and are typically inspiring. And as a result, people get angry because they feel as if that was fake, or it wasn't an honest assessment of the situation. And I've also had situations where it's been the exact reverse, where I've been too honest about something. And I think most of the world suffers from this because they don't want to hear the cold hard truth. But yeah, I thought perhaps this is something you could speak about a lot, because I know you addressed this point. I'm not sure if I did justice to the point you were making, but just the idea of people opting for positivity over honesty in their relationships with people.
Yeah, I think one particularly potentially damaging way that happens is reassurance. And I suspect that sometimes people will get pissed off for the reason because maybe they think it's inauthentic, right? That you're being positive and trying to like lift them up, or that you're crushing their dreams. No, that you are telling them subtly or whatever, subconsciously, that their feelings do not matter. Okay. And trying to pull them out of solving it on their own is another piece of it, the puzzle. So it's kind of like, I picture kids. Okay. So it's like, because I remember this one family I used to help out, and the dad would be constantly telling the little boy, it's all right, it's okay, constantly reassuring him. And that old saying, like the kid's like, there's a monster in my bed, I'm afraid. Oh, there's nothing to be afraid of, right? So there's all these things that I think are said to kids and adults, but let's just focus on kids for a moment because it's whatever.
Sure.
That are basically giving them this message. That feeling that you're expressing is either annoying or ugly, or basically to be hidden or distracted from. Because it's like they'll either tell the kid, you're not having that feeling, or here's a treat or some way to distract you from that feeling, or a punishment because I'm annoyed by you having that feeling out loud. Or I really care about you and love you, and I don't want you to be in pain. All of those reasons I think can lead to this destructive, and I think reassurance has its place. Okay. I'm not saying across the board, reassurance is wrong, there's a place for it, but I want to focus on how it messes people up. Because you look at, remember I mentioned parenting is one of the things that contributes to a bunch of people nowadays being really messed up. Okay. Emotionally retarded, whatever you want to call it. Or emotionally fragile, to be slightly more clinical. Because if you imagine throughout their childhood, they were told to bottle up those feelings, to ignore those feelings, to not really given time, like, oh, you're hurting. Is it because you really, wanted more consideration, that situation, da da da? There's the way I think that would be better handling those things, because then the kid is like given a moment to really investigate their feelings, and maybe some support and some assistance in investigating those feelings, but at the very least freedom to do with the feelings what they can, and then grow up to be resilient, right? Versus people that grow up to be these adults who are like, I can't, that I can't take that feeling. I need to distract myself. I need to lash out at whoever stimulated that feeling, and blame and shame and da 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 da.
Absolutely. No, that's a salient point. I I've often thought a lot about the perfect form of parenting, because on one hand, I do know that adversity, at least a lot of the times, does tend to bring out the most robust, strong children, if it's dosed in the right amount.
Yeah, there you go.
But that being said, that if you have too much, if you give your child too much rules, too much control, they end up having an issue with you, and you don't develop the right kind of relationships. And I would always pose this question to a lot of my friends that were due to be mothers, because I always found this to be philosophically interesting and actually helped me a lot. That if they had to choose between having a child that was going to be extremely successful, extremely able to take on any challenge, because you brought them up in a particular way where they were very resilient and so forth, but they didn't like you, essentially. You didn't have a strong relationship with them because of what you've done. Like one of these parents that's constantly getting their children to do the most difficult things and giving them hardness to develop strong. If you had to choose between that or developing your child in a way where he absolutely loved you had the best relationship. However, your child wasn't able to take on the tribulations of life, these vicissitudes, the highs and lows, because you hadn't given him enough adversity and dealt with him enough, severely enough. What would you choose? And I was always, it was always so beautiful to me, at least, I think every time I'd ask this question, to find that the mothers would always opt for having their child be the best version of themselves, because to me it represents, like, they, as a mother, you want the best for your child even at the detriment of you. And I'd always look at that as much as I personally, on a level, despise that, because I I've always I think my parents are very strict growing up as a kid, and as a result, we don't always see eye to eye on a lot of issues. But I think because of that, I have become very strong. That being said, I think it's the best form of love. It represents the concept of agape, which is this idea that it's not about what you get in return. It's about doing what, I mean, a mother is acting out of unconditional love. They love because they love watching the joy of their child. They're all concerned about the best for that child, whether that is love or that is development. And the idea of a mother taking on the path where they only want the best for their child, even at the detriment of their own, that's something that I think is very profound. And I think that is a great guiding principle in approaching the interactions that you have. I guess if we're going to apply it to that, like, are you doing it for yourself? Are you doing it for others? And what are you trying to achieve here? And I think the thing about empathy is that I'm kind of like going off on a tangent here, I think, but I think when you realize that the way that I look at empathy, that ultimately you are, you're connected and you're seeing yourself in others, you want the best for them, and you realize that it's not about yourself. So whatever your action is, it should be done from a place of what is going to bring about the best result. Maybe if I say it this way, maybe if I have more understanding, maybe this will bring about more of a united front, and this will bring about, or maybe this needs to be said in order to bring about a best situation, in order to make this person a better person. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Can I push back on that a little?
Absolutely. I'd love you to push back on that. That was just
I
randomly
mean,
formed
it's
out of nowhere.
beautiful.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so beautiful, right? What you just
Sure.
said. And I'm not trying to butter you up. I just want to acknowledge that.
Sure.
Maybe I was an only child. Maybe I'm a little bit more selfish than you. Maybe who knows? But I have a knee-jerk reaction towards obligation. And now you weren't using that word, and it's just a word that came up for me when I heard you say that, because, and it's you weren't even intimating the idea of but maybe you'll see where I'm going.
A little, I think, and you're trying to achieve something, and you're obligated to make that child the best that you can. That's
with that. Okay. Yeah. I definitely want to talk about that, but before I forget, the thing that you were just now on, which was tying empathy to compassion, to wanting the best for somebody, things like that.
Yeah.
I don't see those as tightly linked as maybe you do. And it's beautiful you do. Maybe you're just a better person.
No, not at all. I honestly think it was a stretch. No, that's fair enough. But it was a stretch. Now you're at, let's be objective about it. But look, go on.
For me, empathy, it can go in that direction. Like what it did for me, I do love people in general and specifically more. Okay. Especially after this current evolution of, rewriting over and over and over again. It's like, whoa. But a part of that was getting more curious, because part of the training was to ask myself, okay, that person just said this. What are they feeling when they said that? Why'd they say it? What was the underlying need or value that was informing that feeling? And so that pushing yourself to be curious, when in the beginning, you're not necessarily, you're just this selfish, only child person who was just trying to survive, right? Yeah. But that practice of becoming more curious, it led to more compassion and more wanting to help people. But I just maybe, I guess we're saying the same thing in a way, but also not, because not as tightly linked to passion.
No, I completely love the fact you brought that point. I think one of the most difficulties when we're having any kind of conversation about a concept is that there, as we mentioned initially, there are different definitions that people have drawn up in their head in regards to empathy. But I am a stickler for being objective as I can with language, and for right or wrong, like I guess this is because this is the bias, because this is the definition that I most made sense to me, and I'll just stick to this purely. I don't think empathy has to necessarily bring about good or bad. If you define it in the way that it simply allows you to feel what other people are feeling, therefore you understand their perspective. Because granted, a lot of problems arise from people not understanding where someone is coming from. I think when you have that understanding, it allows you to do what you will with that. Now, there's some people that use it for bettering relationships, others that don't care about it. Doesn't change. I think the ability to have empathy, that can make you extremely successful. EQ, emotional intelligence, I think this is all connected. Like when you have the awareness about what someone else is feeling, you can navigate your relationships and so forth. But I don't think it should be tied with the idea of doing good, because simply because you empathize and you have the capacity within yourself to even see yourself doing the most destructive things that someone else may have done, it doesn't mean that you accept that that was the right thing to do and you're going to act in a positive way, which I think can come about if you're simply trying to look at how you can make the situation better. I think if we simply look at empathy from the perspective that you feel what someone else is feeling, you have the awareness, the overstanding of a situation. This is just flowery language that I like to use, because you can relate, not just to understand what they've done, but you have like a deeper understanding of it. It gives you a better place in which to make your decisions and so forth. But I don't think it should be tied with compassion, because it's not. I can relate to the fact that someone may have done something. You chose to kill that person because your life was on the line. But I think Yeah, and I think maybe as a voluntarist or maybe libertarian, you relate to this. Like to me, because my understanding of this is, um, as a utilitarian, you'd say that, oh, you got to look at the circumstances. If it led to this outcome, it was justified. But as a libertarian, you typically take on the attitude, in fact, you do that. Oh, this action was inherently wrong. It was wrong. Period. Right. Now, granted, you may understand why someone did that, but it doesn't become acceptable. So you're like, okay, that was wrong. There needs to be some restitution here. You decide how you go about it. But if you take on this attitude, well, I have a lot of empathy, and because I understand that you'd gone through all this horrible stuff in your life. I'm not holding you as accountable. Therefore, I'm going to, and I think this often happens. People tend to, by being more empathic, think that it goes with needing to have compassion and give a lighter sentence, when in reality, something is wrong. It is wrong. It is wrong. That if you have empathy, it doesn't necessarily change the outcome, but gives you a better understanding of the situation.
Oh yeah, 100% agreement. Ooh, and can I share something
Sure,
that
absolutely.
I really want
Yeah.
your whole audience to hear?
Sure.
That real closely tied it, because I get people that come to the groups and they ask some questions like you have asked, and I think some of that was being devil's advocate. And really close to what we've talked about so far is the idea of the person who is too empathetic in a relationship and the other person walks all over them. Okay. And I think it overlaps a lot with what we've talked about so far, but I want to be real clear that,
Sure.
in my opinion, practicing this system has made me, at least, and I think it would do the same for others, more sensitive in ways that can be defensive. And defensive, I don't like that word right there. I'll try to spell it out. It's like you see through people, and you know yourself so well. And that's really where it begins. You know yourself so well. You know what you want. You know what is good and what is not good for you. And that leads into the seeing through, like guilt trips, manipulation, all the different kinds of manipulations that people do become so obvious, and you become so liberated from guilt and blame and things like that they can't touch you. And there's so many ways they can't touch you. Like insults are like, oh, did you say that thing to me because you're really feeling hurt right now? Or, they can't touch. And with practice, it's one in my groups, I often encourage people, let's play the insult game. And usually people don't want to play it, but then I'll say, well, insult me, just throw, and they'll like, well, that's even kind of hard. I'll be like, make up shit, make up things that are just totally not me. Obviously, if you don't want to talk about my hideous face, then pretend something else, and then they'll start throwing stuff at me, and I'm just, like, oh, are you really annoyed because you really value better smells? You'd rather be around different kinds of smells than you're experiencing right now because they just told me I have a massive stench, or what,
Sure.
So there's another piece of it. Oh, and this bleeds into, I don't know if you read the chapter on, I don't know if it was a whole chapter or not, but intuition, and how for me it amped up my intuition to such a level of I am like a lie detector now. Where and I don't even know why. I have a theory or a hypothesis that if you spend enough years of asking, being so curious about what's going on inside of them while you're observing them, and you're just subconsciously taking in what I guess people take in, body language stuff,
Sure.
that's combining in my brain, like, oh, these movements he's making that I'm not consciously thinking about. Or like in NLP, you learn to consciously look at things and where their eyes going and how are they facing. And absolutely. I don't do any of that. I never have. I mean, except for a short period when I studied NLP until I decided I didn't really like it. But I did take some of that with me. I do see value there. Like you're saying earlier, there's people that use it for manipulation, people don't. Anyway, back to the point. I feel like all of that information goes in and is stored somewhere and related to the storage of the words you said. And in answer to my deeper questions, rather than asking you, boring questions or shallow questions. I want to know deeper stuff. I think it all combines and then gives me a better intuition. And even just like when you say something that doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. And I get this feeling like, whoa, what's up? Something's not fitting here, and I learn more and more to trust that, blah, blah. But again, that could apply to like chicks, is what I'm thinking of. Some chick who calls herself an empath. She's super sweet and she just gives into everything and da-da-da. And she comes to my meetings and she's like, yeah, but empathy is not good for me. I want to look how to, I'm like, well, use this kind, learn this kind.
Yeah.
And then you will be able to do both, and you will know when to do both, and you will see through people and their intentions.
I just wanted to add just briefly, it perfectly makes sense to me how you develop that ability. I think the more that you do something, the more that your brain is able to become better at doing it, your entire being. I think AI is the perfect example of this, in the sense the more information you give it, the way it works, a neural map, whatever it is, the technology, it becomes better. But human beings are like that, just on one dimensional level. But I think your intuition can work like that as well. The more experiences, the more time you have looking into something. So I totally respect that. One just side note that I wanted to mention, because I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. One of the biggest problem I have with people who call themselves empaths, right, is the kind of people that, they just, they go off of this thing. Oh, look, I just met you. I just got a really bad vibe. I can tell you're a bad person. Oh, you're an Aquarian. So I just know that you must be a Leo. Yeah. And they make all of these generalizations, right, based off of like the subtle little things that they see, and they're not right all the time, right? In fact, I would say a lot of the times it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People use this idea that they're highly empathic, right, to make generalizations or to make completely erroneous statements, which they find later to be untrue, but because they have compelled themselves or reinforced this idea within their heads that it must be true because they felt initially, it becomes true to them. And I think it's a problem within the whole, what I'd call empath community. People often don't apply these critical forms of thinking. I mean, I always go off of my intuition, but I don't act on it until it's been proven to me. For instance, I'll think, oh man, this person seems like a really violent person and so forth. But sometimes I'm surprised. I find out, actually, you know what? That was incorrect. But I find a lot of people, they act on this stuff. They treat you, I've met people that make generalizations about who I am, my upbringing, all that kind of stuff, that are completely erroneous. And then they put this into arguments. And besides the fact this is actually wrong, it becomes a very destructive way of interacting with people, because I don't know about you, but I think most people don't like people making judgments about them that are false, and and it comes from a lot of the people that don't like to ask questions. They just deal in pseudo profundities. Like, I can tell that, you obviously dealt with some parental problems as a kid because you're rebellious. That's why you're a libertarian, right? Or, I can tell that you're not very secure about yourself because you're not comfortable with a girl having multiple partners, or whatever it might be, as opposed to asking questions, trying to clarify, did you mean this? Which is something that I very much appreciate in your book, because it was all about clarifying what people mean. Because people, in my mind, they have this idea when they're an empath that they don't need to do that because they know everything, they feel everything. No, I know the reason you said that was because you're insecure and you're really trying to hurt me. No, it wasn't. Yeah, it was, because I feel that. I'm empathic. No, all right?
Yeah. Oh, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
And I mean, I get it, more and more nowadays. You may not understand this, but it's a skin color thing where people are judging me by my skin color.
Oh, you're a white supremacist. You're obviously a left winger. I mean, a right winger.
I've had it easy. I've got privilege. I grew up with just, silver spoon in my mouth, blah, blah.
Yeah. But I think it was really important to clarify. But I really enjoyed this conversation. I think it's been full of really important points that I think a lot of people get something out of. And I just wanted to finish this up because we're going to do an hour, but we've gone for about an hour and a half. Was there anything that you wanted to share in regards to, you mentioned you have a meetup group. Your book's obviously available. Do you want to plug how people can get a hold of you and your book, and just anything you have upcoming at the moment before we wind this thing down?
Yeah, I mean, if they search for my name, Scott Howard Swain, on Amazon, or A Practical Empath, Rewire Your Mind, they can get the book. I've priced it as cheap as I possibly can. And if they have Kindle Unlimited, they could get it free. It's part of that program. And oh, and actually I'd like to plug my the AI that I started creating in 2018 is when I first created her. I call it a her now because
2018?
yeah.
Thought this thing only
And
popped up. All right, I'll let you go on. But yeah, that's
yeah,
surprising.
I mean,
man.
she was fully database driven and kind of dumb at first. And until she got full of data by just being out there on the web and talking to people, she didn't really, but she got pretty smart. And still, I wasn't super satisfied. And then along came GPT, OpenAI. And so I tied into their API and blah, 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 used their that intelligence to enhance hers, to criticize what she was gonna say and tweak it. And now, I mean, and I'm constantly working on the interface to improve it and this and that, but I want people to talk to her. And because she is free, she's like a personal coach. She's trained on my book. So she
wow.
Yeah, she'll ask, she's very empathetic. And she has a strict system that I've developed, and she's got humor, but she refrains from giving advice unless you really push her. Like some people will complain, they'll be like, yeah, she's just asking me a bunch of questions. And
like a shrink.
But kinda, yeah. But yeah. Anyway, so that's empathybot.net. And again, it's free. It's totally private. There's no sign in required or sign up or anything like that. And yeah, so that's one of my contributions. I hopefully get some karma points out of that.
Oh, 100%. I'm going to check that out right now, bro. I love that kind of stuff. And
Cool.
I think it's very practical as well, because people are like, all right, how do I write this to make this more empathic using the system and so forth? So kudos to that. I'll put the links over here. Obviously, people can get a hold of your book. People can get a hold of you're on social media, on Instagram, I presume on Twitter. Practical Empath is out on Amazon Kindle. So I'll put all the links there. And Scott, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on here. It's been a really worthwhile conversation. I think a lot of people get a lot out of it. And bro, kudos. Keep up the great work. And let's, at some point, if you want to come back on, let's do this again. We can expand the conversation. And bro, thank you once again.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great. Bye, Krishool.
All right. Well, as I say, the three things that cannot remain hidden for long: the sun, the moon, and the truth. Kisses, hugs, and belly rubs, everyone. Satyagraha. And illuminate your mind with wisdom, strengthen your will with love, and strive to be the most empathic being you can be, in line with the teachings of Scotty Swain, my brother. My man. I don't need to care where this lonely